Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I know it's been a little bit. I feel like I'm not uploading as much right now as I was in the past, and there's a few reasons for that. One being that my school schedule right now is really chaotic. I got about a month left, and then that'll all be out of the way for this year until the fall. But also, I have had some family visiting, and I've just got a lot of stuff going on right now, so I haven't had as much time or really as much motivation for working on these reviews, especially when a lot of the albums I've been listening to just haven't stuck with me much at all. I do have some more positive reviews coming up soon, thankfully, which I'll probably feel a lot more motivated to work on, and I'm already excited about working on. But for now, I got 7 mini album reviews. Also, another thing I want to mention, one of my ears has been plugged recently. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on with it, but it has definitely made listening to music a lot harder. And it's meant I haven't been listening to music as much while I make dinner or do the dishes or whatever, so I've just been listening to less. And that's fine. I'm sure I'll get back to somewhat of a schedule where I'm actually being a bit more consistent with this. But anyway, for now, here are some reviews that I've been working on. Some of them I wrote like over a month ago. It's really just been a small amount of albums I've been writing reviews about recently, but hopefully I'll get to uploading more soon. Just for now, this is what I got. So anyway, let's start the reviews off with... I talked a little bit about Alessia Cara a few months ago in one of my final blog posts before moving Simon Talks Music to YouTube, when I listed her debut single Here as the best hit song of 2015 in a throwback list that I made. But in doing so, I also didn't shy away from the unfortunate musical trajectory that her career took, where after an absolutely amazing debut single, nothing else she released even came close to that level. And yeah, that's one of the challenges that comes with releasing such a fantastic debut single. But what's interesting to me is that Here was a song that, in my opinion, redefined the idea of cool. Now I know you're thinking, but Simon, I don't remember a global revolution regarding the word cool in 2015, specifically due to that song. And I don't mean that it completely changed the world in that regard, but it was the exact slice of rebellious pop that the mainstream charts needed, and it felt like a new beginning for a potentially exceptional artist who, based on that one song as a debut single, I would have expected to become one of my favorite modern pop stars. And then you get to her albums, which I recently revisited in preparation for this review, all three of them. This was over a month ago by now, by the way. And yeah, they're really nothing special if you ask me, often either falling into pop cliches too much, or at times just trying to be unique without actually featuring the right fundamentals to make good writing. And she's the perfect example of an artist who I really want to like way more than I do. I've seen her interviewed and she seems like a really awesome person. And again, her debut single showed so much promise, and she's a really good singer and an even better impressionist. I've seen her do musical impressions on multiple shows like The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. It's pretty amazing. I highly recommend you check that out. And look, I'd love to be able to genuinely praise her music, but really, I just lose interest really quickly when listening to her albums. I would say she's more of a singles artist than an album artist, but outside of Here, I just don't find her singles all that interesting anyway. And I really don't want you to think it means more than it actually does when I say this is probably her best album to date. Because when saying that, I mean, as a whole project, it doesn't feel as draining as any of her other projects, but it also doesn't have anything close to as good as Here, once again making me even less hopeful that she'll ever reach her full potential as an artist. And I think one of the things that makes this album better than I was expecting is the vocals not feeling as processed. Again, Alessia Cara is a very good singer, and one of the most frustrating things to me in her music has been the production that just doesn't suit her voice at all and really stops the emotion from shining through like it should. And here you can actually hear her singing her heart out on tracks like Run Run and Fire, the latter of which has arguably the best vocal performance here. I also do like that this kind of goes back to the roots of her career with the funkier instrumentation on a lot of these tracks, some of which include what I'm pretty sure are real drums, and the instrumentation feels more layered and detailed and well thought out, as opposed to the popified processing that washed over the pains of growing. I like some of the more out there moments, such as the big burst of instrumentation on Dead Man and the sort of kooky funk style on Slow Motion. And there are other sections of this album that make me at least a little bit curious about the kind of music Alessia could make if she expanded on these ideas. But a lot of these compliments that I can give this album are mostly just aspects that show potential to cover up the songwriting not really being all that strong outside of a few moments, and especially when we get to the Coldplay interpolation on Nighttime Thing, one of the more annoying tracks here, it's a reminder that Alessia Cara really is not an album artist, at least for me. Run Run is probably her best song since here, with the quirky but also quite sad lyrics that pair with instrumentation to make an otherwise depressing track actually have a bit more of a comedic edge. And along with having a pretty consistently decent, outright good track list, I will give this a 6 out of 10. Again, it's an album I wish I liked a lot more than I do, but it is better than I was expecting. I'll give it that much. Alright, so arguably one of my most unpopular music opinions is that Architect's 2021 album, For Those That Wish to Exist, is a legit great album. And it's funny because, as someone who's never really done a full Architect's discography deep dive, the bits and pieces that I've heard of their other music hasn't really impressed me much. But the album that everyone hated wound up really clicking for me, with the orchestral elements adding so much excellent texture, and was a great layer in the really strong hard rock soundscapes, which paired near impeccably with Sam Carter's growly lead vocals. And especially when there were so many great hooks, it led to a really overhated album, in my opinion, which I still don't understand the negative reception for to this day. Now, 2 albums later, they're making what is essentially just a Bring Me the Horizon album, which makes a lot more sense when you find out this was produced by former Bring Me the Horizon producer and keyboardist Jordan Fish. What's a bit more surprising is how much Sam Carter sounds like Oliver Sykes on this project. I mean, look at a song like Judgment Day. Does this not just sound exactly like a Bring Me the Horizon song? Or the following Broken Mirror, for example, which sounds very reminiscent of Medicine off of Ammo. Now, regarding this album's quality, it's fine. I think the screams have some fierceness to them that hit a lot harder than when Ollie Sykes does the exact same thing. And there are some good melodies and feelings of tension throughout a lot of this album. But I also just feel like this is recycling a lot of pop cliches without really adding a whole lot to make this particularly fresh. There are exceptions, both lyrically and musically, like the line, "Is today so hollow if there's no tomorrow" on Blackhole, or the unique genre transitions on Broken Mirror. But the other issue, in my opinion, is that the production feels way too reliant on dynamics, which are cool but can't save such a hollow mix, or make the hooks really pop off when they don't really have a lot of musical substance as far as I can tell. Black Hole is easily the best song here in my opinion, and even then I'd struggle to call it great. There are a few other good hooks here, but most of them are quite underwhelming, and even good melodies like the chorus of Seeing Red aren't always executed super well, in that case because of Sam's vocals, which are usually stronger, even across this album. So, unfortunately, this just didn't really do a whole lot for me. It's not bad, the majority of it is decent, but I'm gonna have to give this a light 6 out of 10, and I probably won't go back to it anytime soon. I'm not really sure there's a bad song here, at least there aren't many, but it's just not doing much. Sam Fender's newest album has been getting quite the mixed reception for its Springsteen worship, which many are saying doesn't really have a lot to offer that's particularly unique. And as someone who isn't super knowledgeable about this sound, it's hard for me to say whether or not I think it is. But I can also say that this kind of heartland rock is a style that, at its best, is so goddamn joyful and hits such a sweet spot for me that I just don't really care how recycled it is. Unfortunately, though, that being said, Sam Fender just doesn't really bring the most anthemic tunes to the table here, outside of a couple moments. And one of the biggest things I noticed about this album is how weak it is compared to the absolutely excellent opening track. The rest of the album just doesn't live up to that at all. Seriously, the imagery of the lyrics paired with such beautiful instrumentation and melodies is jaw-dropping. Sam has mentioned that this song is about the passing of someone who was like a mother to him, and I think he really tried to convey how difficult it can be to see the beauty in life after losing someone like that, but also how great it feels for a moment in time when you feel fully at peace. But look, again, unfortunately from this point on, I just think the album loses a lot of its charm. It's not that I think it's bad, because I don't. It's actually pretty good. I like the sense of potentially undeserved trust in someone on arm's length, which can still have some magic. The guitar outro of Crumbling Empire was pretty cool. Nostalgia's Lie has a really nice acoustic guitar timbre that sounds great in the mix. And the closing track ends the album on a mellower note with one of the best songs here. Oh, and Chin Up, with its morally complex lyrics and sick bass line, is also a legitimately great track. But I don't know, something's just not quite clicking here, and I'm not entirely sure what it is. Maybe it's the production feeling a little hollower and airy than I would have liked. Maybe it's some of the melodic repetition just becoming a bit much. And maybe it's just the lack of originality in the sound being so blatant that it holds us back a little bit, despite most of the foundations of good music being here, even despite what I said at the start of this review. But look, whatever it is, I'm gonna have to give this a 7 out of 10. Again, it's far from bad, but I wouldn't call it essential listening. So, if you're wondering why the debut album from this previously unknown artist known as Venturing is suddenly getting so much traction, which is exactly what I was wondering, well, Venturing is a side project of Jane Remover, who has an album coming out this year under her real name, and personally, I've never really loved her albums. I'll probably revisit both Jane Remover albums later this year before reviewing the new one, but I've just struggled to get into them as much as most critics have. Anyway, that being said, I was curious about this new Venturing project, and I'm once again feeling kind of conflicted. There are definitely some things about it that I like, but after a few listens, I just can't say it's fully grabbing my attention as much as it could. And I think part of it is the fogginess of the production, which I know was an artistic choice, but it still just doesn't really appeal to me. And the massive amounts of distortion and fuzz can just be a bit too much sometimes. And the thing is, if there were more standout melodies, I might be more impressed. But also considering the fact that I'm not the biggest fan of Jane as a singer, just being honest here, it's hard for me to fully love this project. Now, with all this being said, there are some good moments, like the haunting lyrics of Something Has to Change, the subtle yet effective build of the opening track, and Dead Forever is an excellent alt rocker that's noisy enough to not appeal to rock radio, but still feels quite accessible at the same time. I also quite like the thick sound of the production on Haloween. Again, there are moments that I like on this project. But look, while there are some striking lines here and there, and some of the compositions are nice, the overall project just has me feeling underwhelmed, and I don't really see any reason to go back to this outside of Dead Forever, which is easily the best song here. So as a whole, this is a 6 out of 10 for me. Not a bad album, but not a great one either. It's been about 2 years since I last reviewed Inhaler, back when I posted reviews on my blog, for their 2023 sophomore album Cuts and Bruises, which I recently revisited as well as their 2021 debut, It Won't Always Be Like This. This was also over a month ago. And their sophomore album is definitely my favorite of those two, but I've also just never fully gotten into this band. And I wasn't expecting great things from this new album, but I was curious about it considering the positive steps they'd taken on their 2023 album. And unfortunately, this feels like a step back. Look, I will admit this grew on me a bit as I listened to it more. After one or two listens, I thought this was the worst Inhaler album, and now I think I like it more than their debut, partially because I think the production is stronger, which I wasn't really paying attention to on my first listen. I mean, the drums sound good in the mix, the guitars have some nice snarl to them, but also help with the softer moments on the album, and the vocals sound good atop these instrumentals, not just because Elijah Houston is a good singer, although that's part of it. And I think the production does help accentuate some of the catchier hooks. And I think those are worth mentioning in their own right anyway, such as the blazing guitar chorus of Open Wide, the acoustic guitar provides some nice grandeur to Still Young, and there's also Your House. Now, the latter of those has some issues surrounding the phrasing and a real sense of clinginess in the narrative that probably just stems from messy writing, but the bursting chorus is still worth highlighting. And I especially like the song Again, with which I'm on the fence about whether or not it's great, but it has a great bass line and the positivity of the lyrics pairs well with such a bright sound. Now back on the topic of Elijah Houston, for some reason I keep forgetting that he's Bono's son, which would be a sign that his vocals are unique in their own way, but the reason I'm surprised by how often I forget is because he sounds a lot like his dad. And I don't think that's a bad thing, especially because musically this doesn't sound like a U2 album or like it's just trying to impersonate anyone else. And that's the biggest problem I had with Inhaler's debut a few years ago. Not that it felt like a copy of anything, just that they didn't really have their own unique sound. And the influences just completely overpowered any sort of musical creativity, at least the way I heard it. And it's worth mentioning that this album doesn't feel specifically unique to Inhaler. It's a sort of indie rock album that kind of feels like it could have been made by anyone. But emphasis on kind of, because at least it doesn't feel drowned in worship for other bands. Now, lyrically, I've never been totally wowed by Inhaler, although they're far from bad lyricists. I definitely like some moments here, such as the message of embracing your small flaws and Open Wide, this semi-unique writing of a familiar song topic on the Charms, and the closing track is kinda cute. And while we're on the topic of that track, I will mention that it's got some nice synths and distorted guitars, and is probably one of the best songs on the album sonically as well. But really, I don't think this is going to have much of a lasting impact on me. It certainly does some things well, and if you're a die-hard Inhaler fan, you'll probably like this. In that case, you've probably heard it already. But for me, this just really isn't it. And I say this as someone who's never been the biggest fan of this band, but even I liked Cuts and Bruises a decent bit, and this just doesn't have hooks as good, and it seems to fall a little bit toward generic territory. So I'll give this album a 6 out of 10, but that's more due to a lack of serious low points, where I had a hard time picking out one specific least favorite track out of the many forgettable tracks that feel like rock radio filler. But there are still a couple moments that stand out in a positive way, which is why I'm leaning on the positive side here. But still, it feels like a step back, and maybe just another reminder that this band isn't really for me. I'd be curious to hear them experiment a little more beyond just standard indie rock, because that might lead to some great music. For now, I think they're just decent. This is my third time reviewing a Tate McRae album, following her outright bad debut, I Used to Think I Could Fly, and her step up to mediocrity with 2023's Think Later. Neither of which really made me excited for this new album, but I wanted to give it a fair shot. And one of the first things I noticed here is that Tate's singing has gotten a lot better, where it actually sounds like she's trying a bit harder, less of a seemingly half-assed, raspy delivery, more of a sensual, sometimes moody delivery that really fits with the production, which is trying really hard to be sexy. And you know what? I think it succeeds at it some of the time. Emphasis on some of the time, because no, I don't get the hype with Sports Car with that buzzing synth and overpowering percussion that completely takes away from any kind of lush vibe, and it's not even catchy or hooky enough to work as a fun, silly pop jam. But back on a positive note, I generally like the production here more than on previous Tate McRae albums, especially in some of the moments where it supports the melodies to help them stand out more. I'm not even sure the melodies are better on this album than Think Later, but they just have more support from the instrumentation. I mean, just think back to Run for the Hills from that album, which was a really good composition ruined by a final product that just felt way too overprocessed. And also a little ruined by Tate's singing, which I've never been a fan of up until this point. But on this album, we get tracks like Two Hands, where Tate actually sounds way more locked into the song, which really helps the chorus pop off a lot more than it otherwise would have. And I especially like Dear God, which is a legit great song, which I don't think I'd say about anything else in her discography that I've heard. In that track, she tries to escape an unhealthy relationship by hoping that she'll stop liking the parts of the relationship that made her want to keep going back to it in the first place. And the music and performance reminds me a little bit of Amare in that album she dropped back in mid 2023, especially in some of Tate's higher vocals here. But at the end of the day, a lot of this album does feel quite bland, and the melodies are usually just decent, along with some of the lingering production issues still being present, especially like the percussion just not fitting in with the rest of the instrumentation on quite a few tracks. And there's just not really a whole lot that feels worth returning to, outside of maybe a couple moments. So for me, it's a 6 out of 10, but at least that's an improvement, and she's gotten better with each album thus far, so I'm curious to hear more from her in the future. For the past few years, Squid have been one of the biggest breakthroughs in the post-punk scene in terms of critical acclaim, and around the time that their debut came out, critics were often lumping them into the category of bands like Black Midi, Black Country New Road, and Shame. Probably because they all make some kind of artsy experimental rock in the vein of punk music and are all from the UK. Now, at that time, my favorite of those acts was definitely Squid, and they've remained that way over the years, or at least my favorite album of any of those acts is their 2021 debut, Bright Green Field. Yes, better than Ants From Up There, I said that. As it showed Squid, in my opinion, pushing boundaries of what post-punk can be. And maybe that's a little pretentious coming from me, as I don't have nearly the knowledge of post-punk history than more experienced classic rock listeners. But to me, that album felt like a massive breakthrough, where the catchiness and memorability of pop music was absolutely there in a way that felt quite accessible, but also went to some really weird avant-garde places that I think even casual pop listeners would be intrigued by. I mean, of course they didn't become a mainstream success, but that's still really a shame. Now, unfortunately, I didn't love Oh Monolith nearly as much, and while I hadn't been expecting an album as great as Bright Green Field, their second album's lack of the raging punk rock that made me fall in love with their first album did concern me a little bit going forward, and the writing and production just weren't really as impressive either. But still, that was and still is a great album. I went back to it recently, and Squid's artistic vision was absolutely there and mostly paid off. And thus, I was cautiously optimistic going into this new album. I've been noticing in recent years how rare it is for bands to pull off a 3 legit great album run consecutively, but it felt like Squid might be a band who could actually pull that off. And unfortunately, I don't think they did. Seriously, what the hell happened on this album? I'm kind of shocked, honestly, that I didn't end up liking this more than I do. And it might be the most disappointing album I've heard this year. Actually, I'm reading this off a script and realizing there's another album that's come out since, which might top that for most disappointing, but we'll get to that in another video. The thing is, I'm not too confident saying this anyway, because there are enough redeeming qualities that showcase a lot of the things that I've always loved about this band. But in saying that, I also realize I'm trying a bit too hard to distract from the fact that this just really isn't fully hitting for me as much as I was hoping and expecting. Now, look, one thing I've always liked about Squid is their lyrics. Sure, it might not be the most impressive thing on the surface, and I often feel like there's more that they're saying in their songs that I'm not picking up on. That's the majority of artists for me, honestly. But I like the way that they often take one of the most random, specific subjects and turn it into a song that makes you think about humanity and society in a different light. And when you read the story behind a song, it makes you completely rethink its meaning, too. And the way I read it, I think Squid are trying to really challenge the listener with this album. And that's not always a bad thing. A lot of this album revolves around uncomfortable truths, or at least potential truths from a different reality that we as humans don't want to acknowledge. And I think Squid realized that and decided to present it in a way that makes you think, but also doesn't feel all doom and gloom. And look, this isn't completely new for Squid, but I think it's the album where they do that specific thing the most. And they keep it pretty lightweight considering some of the subject matter, like the idea that had we grown up in a society where murder was socially accepted, you, the listener, could have become a murderer. And of course, they don't know whether or not that's true, but that alone is incredibly haunting and uncomfortable to think about. And Blood on the Boulders discusses benefiting from other people's misfortune. I think specifically unintentionally benefiting from it, where one of the most striking lines on the album is, "It's so sad what happened, but what would I be doing if it didn't?" And there's also Building 650, in which the narrator can't see past a friend's good qualities despite all the evil things that said friend does. Sounds a lot like what's going on in the US right now. And again, I'm not against bringing uncomfortable truths to the surface, especially in music, and I often find it fascinating when bands do stuff like this. And sure, maybe the poetry and phrasing doesn't wow me as much as previous Squid albums, but I still like a lot of what they're doing lyrically, and I think it's mostly effective. But focus on that too much, and it becomes easier to forget that the music itself isn't really all that great. I don't think Ollie Judge has sounded less engaged in the music than he does here, whereas on previous albums, the energy he brought to the table was one of the biggest standout factors. And the production often has some really weird, rough edges that were not present on previous Squid albums, and it can really distract from the grooves, with probably the biggest example being Cro-Magnon Man, which has a terrible sounding snare. And this just doesn't have the same amount of energy that those albums had, nor does it feel as experimental. Sure, this isn't pop music or anything, but one thing I liked so much about their first album was how it had so many elements of the appeal of pop music while being about the furthest thing from it. And here it just feels like typical post-punk without Squid's unique identity, crossed with a little bit of noise rock, but not enough where the horror of the album really shines through. And you can make that horror a part of acknowledging the unknowns that Squid make this album about, without sacrificing the optimism and without making it too depressing. But it's a really bad sign when I'm left feeling like so many elements of the album are just there. Yeah, I like the explosivity of Blood on the Boulders, with the mellower first half and the post-punk section later on, and it's probably one of the better produced tracks. And Fieldworks 1 sounds like a Black Country New Road song, sort of similar with part 2, and I mean that as a compliment, even though I don't think Squid do that sound nearly as well. And the title track has just the right amount of spookiness in its sound for a slow burner late in the album. And I'll also acknowledge that Showtime definitely has quite a bit of experimentation, but it just doesn't feel like it's all tied together well in that track like other experimental Squid tracks like Boy Racers or Undergrowth. And back on the topic of the entire project, I miss the uniqueness, even compared to Oh Monolith. That album at least had moments like Siphon Song, which saw the band going in a completely different direction, whereas Cowards just feels like them going backward. It's not a bad album by any means, but I certainly wish I liked it a lot more. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 because there's enough fundamentals to this band's sound that, of course, the album was going to be good, but I just can't call it great. I really wish I could, but this just didn't connect with me nearly as much as I was hoping. It might be a good introduction to this band's music if you haven't heard them yet, but it's far from their best, easily their weakest album to date. Alright, thanks for watching. As always, those are all just my personal opinions on those albums. Hopefully I'll finally get this video posted shortly after filming it, although considering the last few that I said that about, that didn't happen, so maybe I shouldn't be too optimistic this time, but again, we'll see. I've got some schoolwork and stuff I have to work on right now, so I'm not going to be uploading this immediately, but anyway, I have been listening to, like I said, less albums recently than I was before. And I've just also realized, like, I'm not going to review everything that I listen to. I'm going to try to hopefully start listening to more soon, but not necessarily reviewing more because, again, that just takes extra time. And I want to put a bit more effort into my reviews. I feel like these ones were a little higher effort than my last few mini review videos where I just kind of really quickly, like, listened to the projects like 2-3 times and then just posted them, and that didn't really feel good. So Anyway, thank you for watching. I do still have that weekend album review coming out soon. I've started working on it again recently for the first time in probably about a month, and hopefully I'll get it posted soon. I want to review a few other albums, but anyway, thanks for watching. I'll hopefully have more videos out soon. Hopefully I'll finally get some sort of year-end list for 2024 out. Again, I'm still planning to do those. For all of you who do watch my videos, I'm not sure if I have much of an audience, but if I do, if there's anyone out there who watches all my videos, thanks for being patient with me with these year-end lists. Anyway, I'll be back with more reviews hopefully soon.